They had no skills in logging or mining.
But they could become peddlers. That was something they were used to doing, selling, being the middleman. And when these towns are opening up here in the Midwest, up in the Northland, up on the Iron Range, you had miners and you had the company operators. You needed somebody in between because miners needed clothing, miners needed supplies, and the Jewish merchant fit right in there.
My dad came over when he first came over. He bought a horse and a little wagon, and they called them draymen. They'd pick up baggage from maybe the depot and deliver things, and they make maybe 50 cents a day. He saved enough money for a year, and then my mother came.
So he had an uncle in Duluth, a Mr. Mark. So he came to his uncle in Duluth, and he started as a peddler. And he was doing very well and saving every dime. And eventually, he brought his sons over. And after they came over, they earned money too and saved it. They saved enough so that by 1890, he could bring over all of his rest of his family.
They saved their money and sent for the others. That's the way it was with all the families that came here.
Isidore Crystal's father spent the war years in America. By 1920, after peddling goods, cleaning horses, cleaning railway cars, he was finally able to bring his family over. Isidore was 9.
We went through Poland, Germany, into France, and then from France in Le Havre, France, we took a boat, and we crossed the ocean in 2 weeks. It took us 2 weeks to cross the ocean to get to New York.
We took the ship in Rotterdam. I'll never forget the name, the Holland American line, the Rotterdam. We were in 4th steerage. The cattle were 1 floor above us. When we got into Ellis Island, they had long, long tables full of food. You know, cake and bread and jelly and jams and peanut butter, and we never saw any of that stuff because white bread in Europe, where we lived, was like having the finest cake in the world. Yeah, it was July 4th when we got in there, and before we got off of the boat to have examinations, they were celebrating the 4th with firecrackers and all these things that, you know, exploded in the air, and my mother cried and said, "My God, we just left a war and we're in another one."
Think of what these folks were leaving behind, where they had no rights, where they were limited in the occupations they could have, where their religion was constantly being abused and they were being abused, where their worship was being abused, where the pogroms were killing them. They were leaving hell to come to heaven.
Orthodox Jewish families poured into America and into the Northland. Duluth's Jewish community grew from the turn of the century by more than 3,000 or 4,000 by 1930.
It was very common in those days. A fellow wanted a Jewish family. They wanted to start in business. They opened up a little grocery store. That's where the mom and pop stores originated. It was easy. Sometimes many of them lived in the back of the store. In the front, that little area, they put a counter there, flour, bread. There was one on this corner, one on that corner. I think at one time there was at least 40, 50 Jewish-owned grocery stores.
Israel Orakovsky opened up his watch repair shop in Duluth's West End. Abraham and Telly Rubenstein had a fur business in Gilbert. Belle Zimmerman was a teacher in Ashland. From a small boat, the Goldish family sold supplies to sailors arriving in port. The Jews were spreading out all over the Northland.
There are Jews in Gilbert, which is 4 miles from here. There are Jews in Aurora, the entire Iron Range, International Falls, Ely.
4 synagogues were built on the Iron Range, 2 built in Superior. There were synagogues in Duluth for Reform Jews, Orthodox Jews, Conservative Jews. Theaters in West Duluth showed Yiddish movies. The Jewish community thrived. But it wasn't an easy life by any means. Sometimes the land of milk and honey was unforgiving. The Goldberg farm didn't survive the Great Fire of 1918.
Oh, yes, I remember. And like when the fire was coming, my dad and my mother were milking cows, and the sky was just all red.
This is the Golden Medina. This is the golden land of opportunity. What is weather? Big deal about weather. This is opportunity, and that's what they saw. They weren't worrying about 30-degree below temperature. They were worried about being able to find places where they could make a living, survive, and provide a better life for their children.
In America, at least in northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, there were no pogroms, no killings, no persecution. There were spots across America where there was anti-Semitism, even as close as Minneapolis, where occasionally for jobs, Jews need not apply. The melting pot of the North was a relatively tolerant one. Anti-Semitism was pretty much kept to the schoolyards.
We didn't have much trouble like anti-Semitism, so to speak, but there was a little rift, you know. The Poles were called Polacks. The Jews were called Kikes, Sheenies. The Italians were called Wops, you know. There was all kinds of immigration in those days. And they were just, they weren't said in a mean way, you know. But that's the way the kids referred to each other.
It never bothered me, and I never gave it a second thought. Just took it for granted. I played with the Finnish kids, Slovenians, Italians, whatever nationality. We never talked religion. We moved next to the Catholic Church. We had our own cows at the time, and my mother used to make cheese, and a priest used to yell over the fence, Mrs. Siegel, I remember this vividly, can I have some cheese? He says, it's just like the cheese I had when I was in Europe.
Well, there was a difference as far as the religion, but we were always neighborly and always helping each other.
When I think of how they used to taunt us in the old country when we were kids, throwing rocks at us, at least we don't have that here. They may turn around and say, look at that Jew, you know, and stuff like that. But over in the old country, there's some Jews, let's get rid of them.
However, there were problems. Most Northlanders were immigrants themselves, and when some of them came to America, they brought much of their old world intolerance and bigotry with them.
There's one thing you got to remember. When you talk about Jewish history, you have to remember that there were many, many doors closed to where the Jews could go or what the Jews could do. So they got into enterprises that was open to them. You never saw Jewish bankers, you know. You never saw Jews working in utilities.
There are problems. I know my mother had great problems. She was a social worker. She was stationed out. She had a number of homes out on Garfield Avenue near Michigan Street. And I know the story. There was a church somewhere out in West Duluth where the priest used to get on Sundays, and he would give his speech and basically lie and tell his congregation that Jews would slaughter our children or have blood slaughter for blood offerings, which is completely false, and that we killed Christ, and that we continue to do this with children, like we're somehow getting indigent children and killing them when nobody's looking. And that would foment hatred. And I know when my mother, she was on foot door to door for all these people she had to see as a social worker, and I know one time she was chased by people, this is back in the 1940s, who were throwing rocks at her and saying, get the Jew, get the Jew.
When the Orthodox Jews came, they brought their belief, their culture, and their language. That language was Yiddish, a hodgepodge of Old German and Slavic written with Hebrew letters. Mr. Karen of the Northwest Iron and Scrap Metal Company took in his accounts in Yiddish. Parents spoke Yiddish at home, but always demanded their children to learn English. Home life to the Northland Jews was much the same as everyone else's. Adults worked hard in the store, on the farm. Some went out hunting. Children played the same games as their non-Jewish neighbors, but there were differences. Friday night begins the Jewish Sabbath. For Orthodox Jews during this holy day of rest and meditation, there is no work, none at all. Electricity cannot be turned on. Food must be prepared the night before.
They kept Sabbath. They had services here on Friday night and Saturday, and you were not allowed to ride in a car or open light switches or turn on gas.
Now and then on the Sabbath, Jews got some help. A non-Jew, a neighbor perhaps, would work in the store or on the farm, even in the home that day, and keep things going.
I remember distinctly, I had a lot of friends at that time, Gentile boys. We used to do everything together. And I said to one guy, you come up and on Shabbos and turn on the gas and light the fire and everything and ask for a dime, I says, and then you and I'll split and we'll go to the movies. So they did the work, but I still got half of the benefit.
Did your parents ever find out of this?
I think so.
Some other things defining Jewish culture are the faith's dietary laws. In the cities and on the farms and in homesteads, keeping kosher was a part of family life. Food had to be prepared according to strict rules. Cattle and chickens had to be slaughtered in a certain way and by a special person, a shochet.
You go to the corner butcher, and the man is called a shochet, a slaughter. And you'd even go buy a live chicken and you bring it to the shochet, and he would slaughter it for you and pick the feathers. And
on the Iron Range, there was only one shochet, and he was in Chisholm.
There was a streetcar that connected all of the range towns. The steel companies put this streetcar system in. And this woman told me, you know, you never took the streetcar on Friday. I said, well, why wouldn't you take the streetcar on Friday? She says, you just never took the streetcar on Friday. She said, well, you know, these Jewish women would get on Friday morning with these live chickens, and they'd be all going to Chisholm, and this guy would slaughter them, and then they'd be coming home with these dead chickens after they were slaughtered. And she said, it was terrible. You either had the stinky dead chickens, she said, or you had these squawking live chickens. So you never took the trolley on Friday.
It was difficult when we went to somebody's home. We couldn't eat everything they had because many of them had pork, and we're not allowed to have any pork products, and the meat had to be kosher. So I never ate when I was invited to a school affair and they served meat. I just tossed it on the side and I'd eat the vegetables and ice cream if they had it.
Keeping kosher was very important to the Orthodoxy, but many Reformed Jews weren't as strict.
None of the Reformed families kept kosher homes. It just wasn't part of the family ethic or religious ethic for the Reformed families to keep kosher.
They did not keep a kosher home. My father liked bacon, especially on Sunday night.
There was a strong need for kosher food in those early years. Phil Scher's grandfather started his own meat market in Duluth, supplying the area with kosher and non-kosher beef.
I know they used to have, way back, way long ago, where UMD now is, used to be cow pastures, farms. And I know they would go up and buy cattle up there, and they would take a tripod, and they go, hope I don't get caught by the EPA for this, but this, we're talking in the 1800s. They would take the cattle over to Chester Bowl, Chester Creek, and they'd set up a tripod and they'd slaughter the animal up there because there's water, see, and you can wash down the animal and keep it clean. Brutal work. They would load up meat in the back of the wagon, and I understand one of his routes was Proctor, so he would set out in the morning, and this is in the wintertime when it's 20 and 30 below zero, you know how Duluth is. And he would clip-clop all the way up to Proctor, where he would knock on people's doors in little stores, a lot of little corner markets. Hi, I'm here, what would you like? And the man would say, well, I need a side of beef, or I need a round. And if it needed to be cut, he had to go out in the wagon, and he'd take a saw, and he'd saw down the meat in the wagon.
The growing city, that doors east side. And some Jews lived in that darker world.
Although we had a so-called, you might call them a mafia, the gang, but they weren't like the Purple Gang in Detroit or the gangsters in New York. But sure, we had them. We had brothels, we had Jewish madams, we had Jewish pimps, you know, and what the hell? Crap shooters, gambling back of in the alleys, and shoot pool, and pool sharks, and oh sure, they all came from nice families.
A lot of Jews got involved in bootlegging, and then ended up owning liquor stores when Prohibition was repealed.
Like now, Duluth in the first decades of this century had its have and have-nots. Duluth's Reform German Jews were generally more well-to-do than their Orthodox counterparts. Many of those Orthodox Jews lived in Canal Park. It was not a beautiful neighborhood. It was poor.
There was a large Jewish community down there, and eventually, one by one, they moved up between First Street and Second Street, and there were a lot of little homes in the alley there.
Well, the Park was on the hill. It was about 3rd Avenue, 2nd Avenue East, and 9th Street and 10th Street over to maybe about 6th Avenue. And they had their own little shops there, grocery stores, butcher shops.
Despite their philosophical differences, the Jewish community bonded together. They formed organization after organization. There were youth organizations, women organizations. There were labor groups like the Duluth Workmen's Circle. Individuals, too, would leave their mark. Smiles still grow on people's faces when they remember a woman named Ida Cook.
Ida Cook was married to Moses Cook, a very, very observant Orthodox family. Ida Cook has the reputation of being really a tzadika, it's called a righteous woman. She dedicated a great deal of her life to charity, very active in the instrumentation of the sisterhood here, and was very concerned about education. So she was one of the real guiding forces in making sure the children of this congregation and then later throughout the whole community would have a proper Jewish education.
Ida Cook was devoted to children and to their education. Her determination established the first Hebrew school in the North.